Hi, this is Professor Favors, American Literature, Emily Dickinson, five poems. So we're only going to look at five poems of Emily Dickinson. Of course, there are many more. Some are dealing with her relationship to nature. Others are dealing with her relationship or perception of death. And then the last one is dealing with the contrast between truth. So let's begin. All right, this lecture is subject to fair use. All right, because I could not stop for death. So the third selection, because I could not stop for death, one of the most famous poems in the Dickinson canon, forms an important bookend to our second selection in that both poems show Dickinson's precise control of the speaker's relationship to not only the natural world, but also the divine. While death cannot be avoided, neither is it to be feared. The speaker of this poem reminds readers that the omnipresence of death does not mean that death is imminent. Um, so let me read the poem first. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children played, their lessons scarcely done. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. So, one thing I want you to think about first is immortality, the last line in the first stanza. Immortality is in contrast to mortality. So even though we always think we are kind of immortal, that we're going to live forever, death has a different agenda. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. So in other words, he made the decision for me. And death is personified um, using a pronoun he. And so there's a difference between the use of first person I and third person he, and um, death is the antecedent for he. So because I could not stop for death, death being in third person in relation to he kindly stopped for me referring to I as the antecedent. Sometimes you can look at this very grammatically to know what the differences are. So I could not stop for death. He kindly stopped for me. He made the decision. Because I could not stop for death, he made the decision for me, but he was kind about it. Um, it wasn't a sudden death. You know how sometimes people die of tragedy. That's a sudden death. That doesn't mean that they did not have warnings and grace prior to that death. It's just that it was with this is death in process likely. He kindly stopped for me. He showed me kindness. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. So the feeling of immortality again is in contrast to death. The word feeling of or the phrase feeling of is just implied because if she's saying he kindly stopped for me, that death kindly stopped for me, that it stopped the process of me dying. So because I could not stop for death, I could not begin the process of death. Death kindly stopped for me, meaning that it didn't take me quickly. The carriage held but just ourselves, death and me, and immortality. So um, this death here is giving me a process to experience a little bit of life again as I process into death. So we slowly drove. There's the word slowly. He knew no haste. He did not push for hastiness for me to die. And I had put away my labor. I had to give up everything that was connected to my being as a person. My leisure too, that means I gave up work as well as leisure. In other words, in contrast to the previous poem, I had no real choice. I had to give up both labor and leisure for his civility. Civility here means that he's being civil. Not only is he being kind, but he's also being civil. There's a civility to the processing of death. And so then he allowed me the visual of sort of seeing the world continue on as I'm about to continue out. So we passed the school where children played. There's lessons scarcely done, right? We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. So as the setting sun is kind of metaphorical or figurative in this way because now the immortality that you see in the first stanza is going to become mortal in the last stanza. Setting sun meaning that the sun dies so that the moon can come up. It doesn't die literally, but it has to set in order for something else to come up. Otherwise, we will be in light the whole 24 hours. So, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, meaning that um, um, there was a push for death, but death stopped and allowed me a little bit of my immortality. So therefore, he didn't quickly drive. He didn't quickly go to haste. He slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. So I had to submit to his authority. Whereas in the previous poem, the soul selects her own society. She can make a choice. She can make a choice between um, one society over another and not allow it to be imposing. What death is imposing is obtruding here. It's imposing upon her here, but it's civil. And then, of course, as I'm passing on, I'm moving on. I see children playing. I see, I, I perceive that they haven't finished their own lessons, meaning that they have not finished their own lessons in life. They still have their lessons to go through. Children played is both figurative and literal. They could be on a playground and not doing their lessons. And then they can also just enjoy life as children and still have many more lessons to go towards adulthood. And then, of course, the fields of gazing grain and then the passing of the setting sun. So, because I could not stop for death. All right, so this is the end of the presentation. Emily Dickinson resources. There's a whole museum. There's contact information as well as a um, Emily Dickinson timeline. Thank you very much for listening.